Good morning, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, we have allotted 2 hours to discuss the issue of a possible name change for Jeb Stuart High School. We've invited the ad hoc committees to present a brief overview of the group's findings, and we will provide a brief period of time to ask questions about the work of the ad hoc committee. Each of the 2 committee representatives will have 10 minutes to present their reports. Following that overview, we will spend the majority of this section of the meeting, about an hour and a half, discussing a possible motion to respond to the findings. All meeting attendees are expected to conduct themselves with the decorum and respect appropriate to the conduct of the public's business. Please be respectful of the speakers and the board members and refrain from calling out from your seat in the audience. And please stay seated during the meeting. Any signs you would like to show during the meeting are limited to 8 by 10 inches and must be handheld and made of paper. Thank you for your cooperation, and thanks to those of you who have come to observe the work session today. This morning we have Denise Patton-Pace and Kenneth Longmire speaking on behalf of the subcommittees. We, at a toss of a coin, now have Mr. Longmire starting our session. Mr. Longmire, thank you. Actually, before that, both of you, thank you so much for your willingness to come here today, but more importantly, thank you for the thoughtful work that you put into developing this very thorough 7-section report. It's greatly appreciated, and we look forward to your comments this morning. So now I hand off the mic to Mr. Longmire.
Thank you, Ms. Corbett-Sanders. Chairman Evans and members of the board. First of all, let me begin by expressing my appreciation and appreciation of all of my subcommittee on the work that you do. We appreciate what you do for our children and for our county and our community. It's very appropriate for you to seek our views on major issues facing the community. And I appreciate the opportunity to have been invited to serve on the community, and I appreciate your opportunity, your invitation to meet with you this morning. I actively lobbied to be on this ad hoc committee for a couple of reasons. First of all, both my daughters have either attended or are now in attendance at Stuart. I was also interested because I'm a former teacher, and because as a Foreign Service officer, I gained experience in encouraging opposing parties to try to meet the needs of their opponents and to try to find common ground. As a young diplomat in Germany and Jerusalem, and Sarajevo and Belfast, I took a special interest in what and how these societies teach their history to their children. Do they gloss over, or do they deal openly and honestly with the unsavory chapters of their history? As I was making these notes, and this is very personal, and I'm very much into Virginia history, and I'm very much into American history, and as I was making these notes in my office, I looked up and I saw a picture of my grandmother. This is Alice Littlepage Marsh. She was born in Choctaw County, Alabama in 1862. I knew her. She lived a very long time. She was born a slave. And thanks to General Sherman's army, to President Lincoln and the Emancipation, to Reconstruction, she was freed. She was able to attend the Freedmen's School in Mississippi. She learned to read and write. She passed on her commitment to education to her youngest daughter, who was my mother, who was a teacher. And surprisingly enough, I became a teacher too. This woman and her husband, Bill, who was actually born in 1857, would have been slaves if Jeb Stuart had failed. Maybe they would have been freed someday, who knows? But they would have grown up as slaves. No thanks to John Stuart. I have taken your questions and have tried to answer them as best we can. We did review the renaming principles used by Yale's Witt Committee, and we were gratified that their approach was very, very similar to our own. We found that, like the Witt Committee, we found that John Calhoun's principal legacy was fundamentally conflicted with Yale's mission, just as we found that General Stuart's legacy is fundamentally in conflict with the mission of the Fairfax County Public Schools. In this connection, those who are defending the Stuart name have accused us of presentism, applying the values of yesteryear to today, applying the values of today to yesteryear. No, this is very backwards. We object to foisting the unworthy values of some Virginians, not all, of the 1850s and the 1950s onto the young people of 2017. We did not, and we were not asked to seek in legal interpretation of A Code 22191, but I think the board has the facilities and the resources to do that itself. While this decision before this board is a question for the entire board and for the entire county, we believe that the views of the parents and the students and of the elected officials who represent the Mason District or the Stuart Pyramid, we think that our views as parents and students and people who live there and are served by the school should be given some special weight. That said, all the pro-name change members agree that the decision on whether or not to retire the name Jeb Stuart High School is the responsibility of the school board. It's not the responsibility of the parents of the student. And we all agreed on that, and I know you agree as well. As the board has requested, we have submitted the written report, and you have heard testimonies in the various meetings over the last few weeks. And I will just simply say that I am here to affirm what we have submitted to you in writing, and I will elaborate on the concerns. But most of all, we particularly value the opportunity to hear what you're thinking, what your concerns are. It's been sort of a one-way dialogue for the past few weeks, and we are here to listen to you. I'd like to address next the compelling need for name change. There are compelling reasons that reflect unquantifiable moral choices to change the name of our high school. The name is deeply offensive to many students, faculty, staff, parents, and alumni, and to other tax-paying members of our community. We name schools to honor men and women who exemplify our ideals and who make exceptional contributions to society. In our county, we have named high schools after Jefferson, Madison, Mason, Monroe, and General George Marshall, all European American males. The name Stuart reflects the values of the Confederacy. It does not reflect the values of our community today. Massive resistance should be illuminated and repudiated. It should not be commemorated. Stuart, who took up arms against the United States of America in defense of the values of the Confederacy, that is slavery, white supremacy, and racism, did not and does not deserve to be honored by any of us. Displays of Stuart and the Raiders with cross sabers, as with other inappropriate displays such as nooses, Confederate battle flags, sexually explicit materials, constitute a hostile environment. We need to bring the name of the high school into alignment with One Fairfax Statement on Inclusion. In naming our high schools, the school boards needs to recognize the contributions of two invisible groups of Virginians, females and people of color. Renaming Stuart would promptly create an excellent opportunity to overcome this slight. The primary purposes of public schools are to provide knowledge, skills, and civic values, and to inspire young people to respond creatively to the challenges that face our community and country. Teachers and parents understand that it is a challenging but vital task to motivate students. Role models and symbols can encourage or discourage students. The name Stuart does not inspire, it offends. We would appreciate your views on what compelling needs are. There is clearly sufficient support to change the name of our school. Some 34,000 people have signed a petition calling for name change. Other listed supporters include the Fairfax County NAACP, the Jeb Stuart Impact Club, the Tenor Hill Heritage Foundation, People Demanding Action, Showing Up for Racial Justice, NOVA, Jeb Stuart Black Student Union, Jeb Stuart Muslim Student Association, the Minority Student Achievement Oversight Committee, and the National Korean American Service and Educational Consortium and Alumni for Change. You board members have witnessed the number of citizens who have testified and attended the board meetings on behalf of name change. You will also note the polychrome pro-name change community includes young and old, alumni and students, European Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Americans of mixed race. We are Jewish, Christian, and Muslim. We ask the school board not only to consider the depth and the breadth of support for name change, but also and especially the depth of our commitment and the quality and the sincerity of our presentations to you. I will now quickly go into the cost. If I run out of time, we perhaps can address them, but essentially, the administration estimate, we believe, is of a total of $678,000 is excessively liberal. Of the administration's estimated costs, only $23,501 in capital improvement costs for all exterior and interior signs are needed. This means that it's possible to retire the name Stewart and rebrand our school by this fall. These are the only new costs. All other costs are expected, scheduled expenses that will occur anyway. The remaining $654,499 are budgeted and expected from FCPS and school-based booster accounts. As a matter of principle, we believe that since the 1958 school board used taxpayer funds to misname our high school, this school board should cover the cost of rebranding our school. Nevertheless, we, the name change supporters, are committed to a successful partnership with the school system and the boosters to cover the cost of the remaining rebranding our high school. The proponents and volunteer fundraisers look forward to partnering with FCPS and the boosters. All budgets, personal, county, and national, are documents that reveal our values and priorities. Budgets come and go. Some values and priorities change. Some values endure. Cost on its face.
Mr. Longmire, I hate to do this, but
Thank
if
you.
you can just a couple of
All right.
sentences and wrap
Couple
up.
of sentences. All of this is about leadership, and I would like to express appreciation of the Students for Change who initiated this worthy effort. They are the worthy heirs of Barbara Johns and Ruby Bridges and Elizabeth Eckford and countless other young women who have helped us overcome the negative legacies of the Confederacy. We look forward to working with you today and in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Longmire. We really appreciate your comments. Now, Ms. Patton Pace, would you please take 10 minutes and provide an
before the
overview
clock
of your
starts-
subcommittees?
Before the clock starts, I just want to preface to say that I was given instructions that we could answer Ms. Corbett Sanders' questions separately from the presentation, and she had several that were directed to the Keep the Name group. So that is my intention, and those subjects will be covered separately. Okay? And thank you for this opportunity, everyone. It's good to finally be before you and be able to tell you our viewpoints. I'm going to go back to May 23rd, 2015, and there was a community meeting held at Jeb Stuart High School where the results of the Fairfax County Public Schools survey was announced, and the results were that the Stuart Pyramid outright rejected a name change, and that survey was conducted in English, Spanish, and Arabic. The community accepted the results as final because that's our democratic process, and we feel that the name change issue should have ended right there and then. And this was the second time students had been surveyed, because back in 2015, the Students for Change also distributed pamphlets and surveyed student body of Jeb Stuart. And only 60% of those students who took the survey, 60% of those who took the survey rejected the name change. That is written up in the October 20th Raiders Digest. 60% rejected the name change. It should have ended then. But the problem was that the students had already contacted our Mason District Representative, Sandy Evans, who, believing the time was right, introduced them to the NAACP over the summer, and they were on a roll. But essentially, the will of the student body, the will of the Stuart Pyramid has been denied, and this train just kept on rolling. And the NAACP and the students worked very, very closely with Sandy Evans to get the renaming regulation changed to accommodate their being able to advance a name change resolution. The NAACP and the students even worked with Ms. Evans about the survey in the community meeting. They worked on drafting language together for the June resolution and the subsequent July motions. And in the Kojanambi recording or radio show that Marley Finlay did with me a few weeks ago, she even revealed that the NAACP did the research for the students because the students were too busy. So the students accepted the NAACP research at face value without doing their own studies. So small wonder that the keepers believe the name change debate is shining a spotlight on deeper concerns regarding the school board's commitment to good governance and historical truth. The name change agenda is top-down, not community-driven, which is clearly illustrated by the 10,000-page FOIA document obtained by the Taxpayer Protection Alliance. Fairfax County School Board is a nonpartisan educational body and is forbidden by its code of conduct to advance special interests and personal causes. The name change is a personal political agenda and as such is in violation of the code of conduct, and in particular the conflict of interest clause. And to continue debating this name change is abuse of power and abuse of process. And all who would vote for a name change are complicit in violating the code of conduct.
All right, Ms. Patton-Pace,
Yes.
could you focus on the actual report and your findings of the report?
That was
rather-
part of it.
Okay.
So we're asking, and we put that in our report too, that two school board members, Sandy Evans and Pat Hines, recuse themselves from further participation in the process. Now let's look at Fairfax desegregation in Virginia. The civil rights movement in the 60s was born out of truth and justice, and the NAACP did exactly the right thing. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed by a majority of Congress that righted the wrongs of the past. But the renaming of Jeb Stuart High School movement is born of deception, not truth and honesty, and is championed by very few in the Stuart Pyramid. The vilification and slander of the school board in 1958 is a case in point. What the changers don't want to recognize is that we are a Dillon rule state, now and then. And what did this mean to desegregation? That no matter how many lawsuits the NAACP filed, and no matter how many rulings there were in their favor, no one could act without their schools being closed down because their funds would be withdrawn. So Fairfax waited out massive resistance. It did not participate. And once it ended, it moved very quickly. In 1962, the Civil Rights Commission praised Fairfax County for its rapid progress, and Fairfax was the first county in the state to fully integrate, and the year was 1965. We should be proud of that. And it's troubling to me that some of the most vocal changers appear to be engaging a transference of their childhood experiences in the Deep South to Fairfax County. They are not comparable, and it's important to know Fairfax's desegregation history. Now, as far as massive resistance, there were at least 3 school board members who publicly opposed it. One was so vehement in his pro-integration stance that he had police protection, and even the Mason District Supervisor, Ann Wilkins, was listed as opposing massive resistance. And by the way, her land was purchased to help build Jeb Stuart High School. No blacks were ever displaced or forced off their land to build our high school. As far as naming of the school, it's in our report. There was a bitter debate between Franconia and Springfield. They ended up naming Lee High School Lee after the district because nobody could agree. And they changed the policy at that time to prominent Virginians. And Stuart was the only school named after a Confederate at the time, and the country was preparing for the National Civil War Centennial celebration. Everybody understood their history, and if you had gone on the history tour that was very well received, you'd understand the proximity of his encampment to the school, about 500 yards. Now, let's take a look at the Civil War. The Virginia Tech Civil War professor Robertson says that to believe that the sole cause of the Civil War was a slavery issue is to show a remarkable lack of historical judgment. But it seems that many name changers suffer from a deficit of historical facts and context regarding the Civil War. And presentism is very, very prominent in these conversations today. Presentists look back in time from the perspective of 2017 values, and they judge the past. This creates a cultural bias and advances a particular agenda. Presentism does not offer truth in context. They do half-truths because you haven't got the rest of the picture. And it does not help develop critical thinking, which is basic to the study of history. Treason. No one can be a traitor unless they have a trial and are found guilty, and no one was tried for treason after the Civil War, including Jefferson Davis. How can anyone condemn Southern slaveholding states without condemning the 5 Union slaveholding states? And how can anyone condemn Southern slave owners without condemning Northern slave owners? That's hypocrisy. And one must condemn the North and the South. Everybody was a victim of their times and a victim of their circumstances. Would you accuse the members of the 5 Indian nations of white supremacy because they fought for the South? And how about Abraham Lincoln? 3 years prior to the war, Lincoln said, "I will say then that I am not nor never have been in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races." He went on to say that he opposed blacks having the right to vote, to serve on juries, to hold office, and to intermarry with whites. The times, the context. Jeb Stuart was a career cavalry officer, not a plantation owner. He freed his 2 slaves in the free state of Kansas. He fought for the Union in Bleeding, Kansas. And when Lincoln called for a Virginia militia to fight for the Union, the Commonwealth seceded. Stuart was the first and foremost a Virginian and resigned his commission and joined the Army of Northern Virginia. And it was done in sequence in an honorable rule of law manner. And it was accepted before he joined the Confederate Virginia forces. So why was there a Civil War? To preserve the Union. The freeing of slaves was an end result, and Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation executive order because he needed troops and realized there were freed slaves who would fight. A real twist of fate is that Jeb Stuart and Lee did such a good job that the war went far beyond the 90 days that Lincoln anticipated, and it was prolonged. It forced Lincoln's hand, and the Emancipation Proclamation was a military strategy designed to get more troops and to break the will of the South. So really, Lee and Stuart sped up the emancipation of the slaves. They helped free slaves. It's just a twist. It's important to study facts. It's important to look at the historical truths, and some critical thinking should be involved. And without that, you can't learn how far we've come, and you cannot learn to prepare for the future. Now, Fairfax has a 0 bullying rule, and yet the changers have bullied the community and student body to push forward this name change. The students are intimidated in the classroom by changer teachers and called racist and white supremacists by changer students. How does this fit with Portrait of a Graduate? When people do not have truth and honesty on their side, they resort to name-calling and bullying. And bullying behavior has been witnessed in the school during ad hoc committee meetings, the Keepers May community engagement meeting, and even in the gigantic dismantle white supremacy sign at the June 8th school board meeting. Why is this tolerated? The changers, emboldened by the well-financed NAACP's involvement, have attempted to browbeat our community into a name change. The NAACP advertisements and emails solicit its members countywide and across state lines to attend our student pyramid community meetings and encourage people to shout down civil conversation and turn our meetings into changer rallies. Is this the future for Fairfax County and for other schools who may go through this, because others are targeted? There are responsible keeper students concerned about programming cuts, substandard facility conditions, lack of materials and supplies, roach and rat infestation at Stewart. We have a school with serious student needs, low academic achievement, and accreditation issues. In a time of a multi-million-dollar deficit, how can you possibly consider diverting funds, public or private, from actual student needs to a name change? 65% of our students are on free or reduced lunch, wondering where the next meal comes from, and are looking to make their ends meet. They face gang recruitment, live in two-bedroom apartments stacked with multiple families, and English is their second language. How does a name change right these wrongs? Every dime makes a difference toward fulfilling student needs. What will a name change do for the students countywide who are suffering program cuts, who will be shortchanged if Fairfax spends money on an expensive feel-good name change that is of concern to relatively few students? And if the name doesn't change, what effect will it really have on the few who feel badly about the name? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Longmire, Ms. Patton Pace. Now what I would like to do is open up to my fellow board members the opportunity to ask questions about the report as a whole, individual subcommittees, and, or subcommittee reports, and have each one of you answer those questions. We're going to just spend about, I want to say 20 minutes to do this, and if we need longer, we will deal with that. We will take longer. Okay, so please indicate who would like to have the opportunity to ask any questions. Strauss, please.
Yeah, it is interesting in terms of whether we do or we do not, if we decide to make a name change, it's my understanding that the only immediate cost is about $23,000 in a change to a marquee. And I believe in the reports, it indicated that other things over time get changed, uniforms, what have you, and that's not a required replacement other than over time. So I guess that is one of the questions that I have, is that the true upfront cost to a change would be a marquee, and that is about $23,000. I'd just like to hear if that is correct. This Mr. Longmire has said.
That is my understanding. That would include the marquee, the flags in the parking lot, and all of the signage inside and outside of the building. For more detail, perhaps Debbie Ratliff could go into it because she was on that subcommittee.
I'm just going to confirm that. And just as a note, some years ago, Fairfax High School, they didn't change the name, and I think that's absolutely appropriate, but they did get rid of all the symbols of Johnny Reb, and, they just simply moved on. And the school board at the time, I don't think, paid anything for that, but I believe, again, it was at a very low cost that they made internal changes in the school. So it is the $23,000 is all that would be needed for basically a marquee change. Thanks.
My understanding, yes.
For a marquee change, may I address that? It is my understanding that the keepers feel that just doing an incremental change is demoralizing to the students at the school. And if the name has changed, you've already been given notification that the athletic boosters will disband. Not that someone can't pick up the ball, but it has to be a complete new 501c3 and a lot of changes there. It also would affect the PTSA, which is another complicated process, and someone else can really address that for you. But that's a whole state, national charter. There's a lot to it. And so just to simply say that there's cost for marquee and a few things like that, it's a much deeper issue, and I think that's kind of glossing over the surface of the problem.
And I guess maybe that would be a question of our own facilities or what have you, because I know there has been a concern over cost, and that is something that we need to know one way or another. Thanks.
Ms. Schultz, please.
Yeah, I guess, Mr. Longmire, when you were speaking, you said that you felt that it was the role of the full board to make this decision, but that the views, quote unquote, the views of parents and students in the Mason District and Jeb Stuart should be given special weight. How do you, I'm wondering how you square the notion that they should be given special weight with the fact that the Stuart Pyramid in Ms. Patton's presentation was surveyed in English, Spanish, and Arabic, and voted overwhelmingly not to accept the name change. Isn't that the special weight? And how do you respond to that?
I'm having trouble following that, your question, quite frankly, Ms. Schultz. Obviously, I am
let me clarify.
I'm in the Stuart Pyramid and the parent, so I guess that is sort of my personal preference, obviously, an opinion, but that's an opinion.
But let me clarify the question, because I want to make sure my question is clear. You said that the views of parents and students should be given special weight, but when they were surveyed, and they were surveyed in 3 different languages, they chose not to have a name change. So isn't that the special weight of actually surveying the students in the building in 3 different languages, and they chose not to have a name change?
I think I get it now. I didn't want to get too much into the survey because surveying is a highly skilled profession, and I'm not an expert in it. However, I would just make a couple of points. First of all, according to the survey, and I'll just use it here, I think about 35% said they wanted a name change, and that is a very large number. My wife and I are on all the mailing lists for the school system, for example. We never got the survey. It was finally emailed to me by a friend. So it's a question of distribution. And as I said, I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about the survey, but it's a self-selecting survey. It was, as I said, erratically distributed. But this drives me back to the comment that my colleague here has said, and that is, it was a survey of opinion. The decision, it was not over and done with. This issue, as many issues, are not subject to a plebiscite, a community vote. It's an advisory opinion, but the decision rests with you, not with me.
Okay, but I'm just saying that in terms of the statement that should be given more weight, if I am a board member and to give the voice of the students more weight, I'm trying to bring to a nexus that if I do give it more weight, that lends even more of a decision to they voted not to, and not just in English, but in Spanish, and I actually didn't know that they were surveyed in Arabic. And then what about the second survey done by the actual promoting change students that also said not to change the name? What are your comments on
I
that?
can't speak to that, but I can only repeat myself, and that is you and I are sort of talking about different things. You're talking about the survey. I'm talking about the community as a whole, of those of us who live there and who are surveyed and the officials who represent us. But again, I repeat, it's a school board's decision. No matter how the survey came out, this is not subject to a plebiscite.
I'm just trying to take the initial comment that when the board makes a decision, it should take, from your perspective, as I understand it.
From Ken Longmire's perspective, yes.
The views of parents and students should be given more weight, and so I'm trying to bring into the fact that the students were surveyed twice, and both times they chose not to do it. And then I have another question for both of you on, and it was the last point. If the argument is that it's a moral imperative, and Ms. Strauss, this is a little bit follow on to your question. If the argument is that it's a quote unquote moral imperative to change the name, then how do you substantiate only incrementally changing the things that have the name on it? Either it is moral imperative or it's not. Because if it is a moral imperative, then having students continue to wear uniforms or, I don't know, lockers or, whatever has the name on it. If it's a moral imperative and you're asking the board to decide on a moral imperative, then if the board decides that, if the majority of the board decides that, then it has to be done outright because it's moral. But if it's not a moral imperative, if it's something else, then you can drag it out over time, but then it's not a moral imperative. So I'm trying to get to how could this possibly be done incrementally? If the decision is, or if the ask is that it's moral imperative, doesn't it have to all be done at once? And you can take it in whichever order, but I'd like you both to comment on it.
Yes, the keepers feel that if you're going to do something, you do it all right away. It would demoralize the students. They're suffering enough right now from what has been happening. And actually, there was one other survey that was done. So the students have been surveyed 3 times, and they still rejected the name change. So I think that to drag this out any further by carrying on with an incremental change is just too much to take. And, of course, we don't want you to change it at all because we feel that there are other moral imperatives that are more important, such as those student needs.
We would like to see it done as quickly as possible. I never advocated that it be dragged out or it be done with, quote, all deliberate speed, unquote. I don't know exactly how many weeks. I happen to know a lot about band uniforms, for example, and it can be done quickly. Sometimes we've changed band uniforms. We simply change the epaulets. We change whatever is written on the lapels. I don't know how many days a week it would do. Yes, it should be done very quickly, but if it cannot be done all within 1 week, that does not invalidate the moral imperative. We'll do it as quickly as we can. It should be done as quickly as possible.
And then finally, on the question of a moral imperative, are the moral imperatives of the academic needs and the social emotional needs in the school taken into consideration with a quote unquote a moral imperative of a name change, and which one is more important?
Not an either or issue, it's a both issue, and it's our view that changing the name will improve the learning environment. It will improve the teaching environment, the working environment. It's not an either or. This is a false dichotomy.
I believe this whole issue is operating in a void of historical context, and I don't believe that, I think there are academic failures. I don't think history is being taught in context. I think there is a group of teachers who have been advocating for a change, who were teaching their opinion, who have misled the students. I believe that the atmosphere at the school is tense unnecessarily, all because of this issue. And I think the moral imperative would be to take a look at what is happening to the majority of the students. And if a few students who've been leading this change, and it is percentage-wise a very few, prevail, I think you'll have a very demoralized majority.
I'll continue this after we finish our question, but the moral imperative question and the expenditure of resources are inextricably tied. So there is, there are
Ms.
set
Schultz,
priorities.
can I suggest we put
and I'll
that
continue
to our
that.
roundtable discussion amongst board members when we get there? And so if I can have Ms. McLaughlin, please.
Thank you, and thank you for reinforcing the clarity that right now we're just asking questions and then the board will have its own deliberations. So my remarks right now are purely questions only for the work of the committees. One of the things that I think is very helpful to me as a board member is always to look at other school systems around the country that can help be guideposts to us about their efforts. And so I was hoping both committees could speak to what other school systems around the country that you researched and identified that were wrestling with this very complex decision and what you learned from those school districts. And if you didn't do that, if neither committee did that, I would like to understand why that was not part of the committee's work.
I personally did not research what other public school systems were doing. We did look at, certainly, and it's all in the newspapers, about various jurisdictions changing names of schools and monuments and many other things. We looked at that. We did look at the Yale DeWitt Committee report, for example. But as far as public school systems, I look to Fairfax County as a leader. I look to you as leaders. We are the most blessed county in America in many ways in terms of resources, financial resources, intellectual resources. Biggest, richest county in America by some measurements. We should be leaders. I've just come back from a week visit to Mississippi and Alabama. They don't have anything like the resources we have here. We should lead.
We took a look, and we're following Houston, which was a different situation than what we have with Fairfax County and Jeb Stuart, in that the school board was allowed to act unilaterally. It wasn't in their regulations to even involve the constituency as far as we could ascertain. And they unilaterally did act to change the names, and now there are very expensive lawsuits as a follow-up. But one of the questions that Ms. Corbett Sanders asked me to address was about Princeton. And I find that extremely fascinating. And I'm very glad that she asked me to mention or talk more about that. So for just a moment, I'd like to address her question about Princeton because I think it's a nice segue into your question. What
If
Princeton...
I can clarify, I asked about looking at the principles used by Yale, Harvard, Georgetown, and Princeton.
Well, the question that I had was provide detailed criteria used by Princeton. And I don't know about Yale. So I looked into Princeton because it was in our report. I'm sorry. And then specifically renaming versus education on the history pertaining to President Wilson as a segregationist. What the Board of Trustees at Princeton did was they tapped the resources of 9 universities and 9 professors, some whom were experts on Wilson, some who were experts on racism and the time frame, and they asked them to come back with a report. And the overall summation was that they needed to contextualize. They needed to bring context into the scenario at the school. And they decided not to rename any buildings because of the legacy that Wilson had brought not only to the university but also to the country. And they had steps that they outlined that they would take. And they were interesting as well because we were advocating that you take a look at the American Civil War Museum, Christy Coleman's philosophy that you broaden the landscape. And that's exactly what Princeton has decided to do. And they have been able to have lectures and programs that brought the students up to speed on the times, the man, and the dilemma. And the student reaction, and there's one that I thought was really interesting. It was a young woman from San Diego who's African American, and she said she was disappointed the university did not choose to rename Wilson College. It's a social place where students are supposed to live. And she found it jarring that the college is named for this figure who didn't even want them to be there. But she understands why Wilson's name would remain on the school because of his role as one of America's foremost diplomats. And what I think this does is brings into question all of Fairfax County, which I know was something that you mentioned the other night. Why is Jeb Stuart High School being isolated from the big picture of Fairfax County? If we're going to really contextualize, then we need to take a look at the big picture, because Virginia was the Civil War, and there were slaves in the North and the South. It was the times, context. Let's not judge the past by the present, but let's understand how it made us who we are today. And that's what Princeton is doing. And there are 4 different things they're doing, but I can give that to you later.
May I quickly respond to Ms. McLaughlin again, please?
Sure. Just please make it brief.
Great. This is one of the largest school systems in America, as you know. The principles involved are very much like the principles so eloquently outlined by Mayor Landrieu in New Orleans. But taking down some statues overnight is mechanically quite easier than changing the name of a school system the size of my daughter's school. The logistics are quite different. But as I said, we should be out front here.
So I would like to just provide some clarity on my question. I certainly take great pride in serving this school system and recognize that we are the 10th largest in the country. But I also was a community advocate, and I know change is really hard. And I've gone up against this school system on change. And I would like, especially for those who will watch this video and for here in the audience, this school system will be a better school system when we have the opportunity to look at other school districts who have been successful in grappling with this very complex issue. And so the reason I asked, and I appreciate both of you with your substantive responses, this is something that I feel strongly that this board will need to do. We are not the only leaders in the country, and I'm very proud to live in a country with very strong public school systems outside of just Fairfax. So thank you.
Thank you. Now we have Mr. Moon, please, followed by Mr. McElveen, followed by Mrs. Hines.
Thank you for the presentations by both of you. As a person who learned American history for the first time and probably formerly last time, 40-some years ago, when I was in high school, that, reading your committee reports, especially subcommittee one, where I found that to be quite fascinating. There were many things contained in there, never knew, never heard of. So it was very educational on my end, and I thank you, both, committees, both sides, whether it's changers or keepers, for giving me as a board member that opportunity. Having said that, there seem to be a points made by both committees where see some differences, maybe even to the point that the other side may be wrong on facts. So that's where my questions will go to both of you. I'll go from left to right. So Ms. Patton, I'm sure that you have read thoroughly, probably more than once, of the other side subcommittee one report. In your reading of the other side's report, subcommittee one, which purported facts they presented in their report, you believe to be not facts. Maybe there may be way too many from your perspective to give me a short answer, but I would like to see more important non-facts contained in the other side's report. And I'll ask you the same thing, Mr. Longmire, so be ready.
The facts have to be presented in context to be whole facts. There's a lot of half-truths. And when you only present something in an isolated situation, that is not an entire fact. That's how I look at it. So, for example, to say all Confederates were traitors, you have to have a trial, you have to have a verdict. And that did not happen. So the whole point after the war was reconciliation, and there were no trials. However, Jeff Davis was actually held for 2 years and never tried because they didn't think they had enough to be able to get a verdict. So these types of things have to be presented in context. If you're going to accuse someone of being a traitor, then you have to have the facts to go with it. And I also think that due diligence was not done on taking a look at the 1958 school board. It's there. We had to really dig, but all those minutes are available, and you can see. And there's a biography on someone named David Scull, who's also on the NAACP website. That biography has names of school board members who supported the NAACP in their efforts. Those are facts. So to say that Fairfax County participated in massive resistance, where are the facts? The facts are that they had to wait because of the Dillon Rule. Those are the kind of misrepresentations that I feel are replete in their report. The whole picture is missing. And the lawsuits, the NAACP, you got to give them credit. If they hadn't kept lighting the fire there, massive resistance might have dragged on forever. They did their job, and they did it well. And they filed more lawsuits in Virginia than any other state. But that didn't mean that the school districts could just turn a blind eye to the Dillon Rule, because then you weren't funded and the schools closed. Those are the facts. Those are the types of things that I take exception to in their report.
Thank you.
Mr. Longmire?
Yes. Yeah, thank you. I was just trying to photograph the other side's presentation. I wished I had it in front of me to elicit specific facts. Let me say that, first of all, I read many things that I thought were incredibly irrelevant. And secondly, a lot of misrepresentations. In terms of pure facts, I'm just trying to come up with great precision, and that's so difficult. But certainly the whole issue, for an example, about their portrayal of the causes of the Civil War. Every reputable historian will say, and in the own words of the Confederate leaders, the primary purpose behind the secession of the Civil War was slavery, white supremacy, and racism. That's documented in the Confederate leaders' own words and their own documents. Secondly, we have never said that this is about who owned slaves. And that other side has consistently misrepresented us. It is not about who owned slaves. It's about who took up arms against the United States in defense of slavery. And Article 3, Section 3 of the U.S. Constitution, and you're an attorney, I'm not, as well as the Code of Military Justice, spell out exactly what treason is and what the punishment is if you were committed, and he was not convicted because he got killed during the war. Who knows what would happen if he had survived the war, but we don't know. But we have never said it was about who owned slaves. It was about who took up arms against the United States of America in defense of slavery.
Well, I'd like to add one other thing. The Ordinance of Secession for Virginia stated that they were seceding because of oppression of the southern slaveholding states. They said southern slaveholding states because they were making a distinction because they were northern slaveholding states, 5 of them, the border states. So it was oppression that they were talking about. And if you dig deeper, you'll find that there are really parallels between why the American Revolution was fought to get free of Britain and why the Southerners felt they were being oppressed by the federal government. The taxes, the tariffs, being able to trade with Europe, being able to sell their products, being able to get the ships. It's incredibly complicated, and this is what is missing from this entire discussion about the Civil War. It wasn't all about slavery. It was far more than that. And again, every generation is a victim of their times and their circumstances, and context is important.
Ms. Corbett-Sanders, may I ask just a couple more questions, very short questions? Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Longmire, earlier you talked about survey results. Those may not be a scientific survey. Those are sort of self-reported survey, 35% versus 65%. If I'm not mistaken, you seem to have said that 35% is substantial. In your mind, that as the board I agree with you, it's the board that's going to make a decision on this particular issue. 35% is sufficient to be a part of deliberation to find compelling need for change?
I listed a lot of compelling reasons to change. I did not list 35% as a compelling reason, if I'm following you accurately. There are a whole list of compelling reasons, as I said, starting with number 1. It's offensive and it's a hostile environment to teach and to learn and to work.
So should we set aside the amount of support, 35%, in finding compelling need?
Yes, sir. I would not say set aside, but I would think would put it in a larger context. Again, of the design of the survey, the fact that it was self-selecting, the fact that it was distributed as such, and certainly the wording of the survey.
So
I'm saying, I'm urging you to put it in context, not to discount it altogether, but to put it in the proper and broader context.
Okay, so hypothetically, if the extent of the self-selected survey results show 20%, 10%, would that make any difference for the board finding compelling need or not?
I'm just not sure. If I could just comment, I was a high school teacher. I was a high school student. I have a father of 2 high school students. And the name of the school for high school boys have other priorities: sports, grades, other things, not necessarily in that order. I think a lot of students would take the, whatever you name it, it's no big deal. That's too bad, because a name of a school can be inspirational. It should be and can be a teaching tool in itself. So whatever is too bad,
Okay,
But
thank you.
it just, they've got other things on their mind.
Thank you. Ms. Patton, I have a different question for you.
Oh, I'd love to speak to that
I
first
know,
question.
Let me ask you a different question.
Mr. Moon always asks great questions, so you'll like this
I
one
like
too.
that one. I wanted to answer.
I'm going to set aside the differences in opinions on whether Fairfax County School Board back in 1958 participated in great resistance. I'm going to set that aside. There seem to be differences in opinions. Whether it is the view of the keepers that the name of Jeb Stuart is not offensive in 2017 to the community of Stuart High School.
I believe that the community answered that question in the survey. Only 1/3 said they wanted to change the name. By far, the majority of the community does not find the name offensive.
Okay, thank you.
And by the way, I was a history teacher too, American history.
I love to learn history. Thank you.
It's been a great experience. I have to thank you all for this. I've learned so much.
Mr. Moon, is that it?
For the time being, I'm done. Yes, ma'am.
So Mr. McElveen, please.
So first, I want to thank both of you and your committees for the seriousness, knowledge, and passion that you've brought on both sides to this discussion. And I appreciate Ms. Patton Pace thanking us for giving you this assignment. But I think we need to thank you for all you've done. So I want to hear your thoughts on potential compromises that could be accepted by both sides. I understand that was not in the original motion passed by the board, but I do know that that did come up in the discussions throughout your time of service. And I certainly understand on an issue like this, it's difficult to reach compromises. We as elected officials can fully understand that. And it may be the case that your respective side would not see any compromises being appropriate in this situation, but I'd like to hear both of your thoughts on that.
Well, I understand in the Russian language the word compromise is always preceded by a pejorative adjective, but so it would depend on what sort of compromise it was put. Someone suggested that we call it Jeb Johns, which I thought wasn't even funny. So hyphenated names or something like that. It depends on what was being proposed. As I have made the point to everyone over and over again, I was doing a survey of the names high schools already we have here. 26, depending on the categories, 26, 27, I can never make up my mind. And I was looking at it and I thought, well, let's see. Half of the people in the state, in this county, in the school are females. Fairfax County is around 10% black. It's changed. Virginia is 20% black. It once was 40% black. And out of the 100 years of our history, haven't we found one female, one person of color who is worthy of being honored by having his or her name on a high school? You know, the invisible people, females and minorities when it comes to naming high schools. What's up with that?
Thank you for asking that question, because the keepers have been giving great consideration to what can be done to mitigate the fallout, either way, of this issue. I have to reiterate that the majority of the community and the students who've actually been surveyed 3 times now have rejected a name change. If we keep the name, how do we move forward? And I really take heart in what Princeton has done. And I take heart in the quote that I read to you, because the young lady was 18 and she felt, why are they doing this? You know, Wilson didn't even want me here. But then she said she understands his legacy. And I think that's what maybe we need to do. And I think it's not just the legacy of Jeb Stuart, but it's the legacy of the Civil War and how it affected our nation and moved us forward. I do not understand looking backwards. I appreciate looking forward and being an optimist. And I think maybe we need to do that in the entire county. So again, what Princeton is doing really reflects the values of the American Civil War Museum, where you broaden that landscape. You add statues, iconography, is that how that word is stated, to reflect the progress that was made. There's a mural that one of the students keeps saying offends her. Well, why hasn't it been painted? I don't understand that. You've got an art department. There's a career in corporate murals and walls. Have a contest with the students. Change it. Do things to involve everybody in making some of these changes that denote progress from the times of the Civil War going forward, and bring an understanding of the civil rights movement, which, you know, I don't even know that that's well understood by students today. Let's add to it. Let's broaden that landscape. And as far as Jeb Stuart, one of the questions that Ms. Corbett Sanders asked me to speak to was more about the Stuart family. They've been here since 1726. They fought in the American Revolution. They fought in the War of 1812. They've been judges. There was even a Stuart who was the 47th governor of Virginia. This is not a family to be slighted. And one of our ad hoc committee members is a Stuart. And two of the students at Jeb Stuart High School are Stuarts. They are relatives of Jeb Stuart. Let's take a look at the big picture, and let's get everybody comfortable, and let's change some of the iconography. Let's have mottos. Let's follow Princeton and the American Civil War Museum and take a look at how we can contextualize it.
So I would take from those comments that on both sides there really is no compromise. Just one brief follow-up, and then I'll turn it back. You talked a little bit about if we were not to change the name, how it would move forward. But if the board did choose to change the name, what are your suggestions on preserving the history of Jeb Stuart High School and all that's come with that?
We have said we want to erase nothing. We want to rebrand. The history of the school, the diplomas, the trophies, the banners. Remember, my oldest daughter graduated from there, and she was very active, and her name is on a lot of stuff. This would all stay. And there are many ways, including putting up plaques and other informational materials in the lobby. We are not trying to airbrush Jeb Stuart out of the history of the state, of this community, of this school. We want to teach a broader history, to teach our children and our community about all the other people who have contributed to the society that we enjoy today. So nothing will be erased, nothing will be destroyed. It will be rebranded, but all of the trophies and diplomas and awards and so forth will be preserved and not hidden away. They will be on prominent display, is our view. And yeah.
I would have to agree that we would want to erase the history that went before. At the same time, that was interesting because that was one of the tasks that the committee was given to discuss, and the group opted not to address it because they felt it was the cart before the horse. But I would be very, very disappointed to see everything just erased and disappear.
I think there's an area where we agree. Seize that moment.
We did find a compromise. Okay, great.
Ms. Hines, please.
Thank you. And I will also just echo thanks to you two and to everyone who's here today. Thank you so much for all your work and for being here today. I think the school board gave the community and staff a pretty tough task about a year ago. And I'm not sure that we gave a lot of direction either, or that the direction we gave ended up making sense, So I know that you've done a lot of hard work and you have produced really good work. And I've actually read all of it. And I think we have so much, not only to honor your work, but also just that we have so much good information here that I think it's important we don't lose it. And one of the concerns that has come up in the community, I think, is, are we going to go through this every time someone has a problem with a name, right? And when you look at our schools, we have several names that are in one way or another possibly problematic, right? So I think the question I'm going to ask both of you is, do you see a way that, after we make the decision about Stuart, so kind of setting that aside, do you see a way that we could use the hard work that you've given us here, the results of your studies, to move forward with a clearer criteria for the future and a better process for the future? I just wanted your thoughts on that.
That's a deep question. I have to think, and not just off the top of my head. How to move forward. I actually think I also was on vacation last week, so I've heard a little bit secondhand, but I heard that Ms. McLaughlin waxed eloquent the other night about Fairfax and considering the big picture, and that there isn't policy and there's no precedence involved in what we are all doing right now. And I think very careful consideration should be given to policy. And I do believe that we should be considering all of Fairfax, and we need to, again, consider context, the times. I think that there's a lot of due deliberation that could take place. I would like to see Princeton as a model in how they handled it. And maybe going forward, take a look at something like that. The rector of George Mason University did offer the opportunity to study and bring context to the discussion. I would say maybe Professor Robertson at Virginia Tech. Now, I'm a Michigander. I don't know a lot about Professor Robertson, but at the history tour, there were keepers and changers who had all gone to Virginia Tech, and they all extolled the virtues of Professor Robertson and how much they loved his Civil War class. I'd like to see him weigh in. I think we could expand this conversation and come up with something definitive as a way forward.
Thank you, and again, for the opportunity to serve. I've enjoyed working with my neighbors, both on the pro and con side. It's been a lot of fun, most of the time. I've given a lot of thought as to where we go from here. If a similar question should arise again, and if you make the just decision to change the name, then we have to decide how to pick a new name, and I've given a lot of thought to that. But very briefly, sticking to my absolutely firm belief that it is a board decision, I would say that when the question comes up, you say to the community, we are considering doing this. You are invited to come and appear before the board, to estimate, to write, to submit papers, and then the board bites the bullet and makes the decision. This has gone on now for, 2.5 years or so forth, I think much too long. The next procedure should be efficient, expeditious, and definite. But it is, again, the reason you are elected officials to represent us. We pay you these big bucks to make these hard decisions. So listen to the community and then decide, and do it, as I say, promptly. I don't see any I would not recommend, even though I value the opportunity to serve on this committee, I wouldn't probably want to do it again. No, I think you should go through this long procedure again with surveys, and this is just, I would just move quickly.
Yeah, and I do think that the different ways that different organizations have dealt with it, you mentioned Princeton, but Yale as well, and different organizations have come up with criteria and processes, and so I appreciate being able to read about that in your research. Context is important, and we keep talking about that, and I think the context really of our decision is that we are really reviewing the decision of an earlier school board, so that is important context. And I think, in my opinion, you have to read both reports and all the addenda to really get that full context, and so I appreciate that. I wanted to ask Ms. Patton Pace, since you're representing the side that is against the idea of changing the name, is there a circumstance in which you think, and if you can speak for your whole group, in which you think that a name change would be appropriate?
Mr. Wilson asked me a question the very first time I ever talked to him, and he said if that community survey had turned out differently and the community wanted a name change, what would you say? I said, we wouldn't be having this conversation. If the community wanted a name change, so be it. And if there was money for the name change, so be it. But it has to be both. And the community has spoken, and it doesn't want it. And the students have been surveyed 3 times, and they've said no. And my colleague here says it's your decision, which it is legally, But the community feels it is the community's decision because it's our school. That's how we feel. There's a very personal attachment to that school and the time and effort that goes into maintaining that school. This is a very special school. It is high need, and the community spends a lot of time and money supporting that school.
So I'm hearing you say it's pretty much community vote and money would be your criteria going
If the
forward?
community voted that they wanted a name change and the money was there, I wouldn't be here.
Okay. I thank you. So just the last point I wanted to make, to answer Ms. McLaughlin's question, there actually is buried in the appendices, and it just recently happened, Henrico County in Virginia, just this spring, voted unanimously to change the name of Byrd Middle School, one middle school. So that's just an example from Virginia that it has been done here. So thank you.
Ms. Koufax, please.
Thank you, and thank you both for being here. It was my amendment over a year ago that asked the community to come together to try to come and make a decision because this is a difficult conversation, but it's a very important one. And I thank both of you and the entire team for taking your passions, bringing them out, and presenting them to us. Mr. McElveen and Ms. Hines both asked my questions. My one was about, was there any joint conversation between the two sides to look at this in a broader landscape? And meaning, was there the attempt to come together and compromise? What I was hopeful, and I don't mean this in any disparaging way, because my desire to have that amendment and to have the working group was, I did hear the preliminary results of the survey, but I also felt the passion behind the people who wanted the change. And just say for the record, because so the public can hear, the people who have not taken the time to read the reports, can you please tell me the results of the 3 surveys?
The results of the May survey was only 35%. That was the community. That was the one done in English, Spanish, and Arabic. It was only 35% wanted it. The survey that I know from the report of the Reader's Digest that was done with the students, and that report, that magazine report was October 2015, it said 60% of the students rejected. Now, I did ask permission to have one of my colleagues be able to answer some of the questions, and Kate Walter is here, and she was part of the community engagement subcommittee. She might be able to answer the 3rd survey better, but my understanding is that the community engagement committee was split just like all the committees were split. And so it was kind of a rogue survey, but I will ask Kate to talk about that survey and what happened.
As part of our Subcommittee 2 report, we agreed to go ahead and do a pre-survey of students at Stewart High School and what their information needs were to participate more fully in this discussion. There are 2 members of our committee, the student member and the chair, developed a survey and had it implemented without a review by anybody else on the committee, certainly none of the keepers on the committee. The result of that survey was predominantly that the kids didn't want the change, and focus, a lot of their responses were, are there when can we get dividers in the boys' bathrooms? Who's going to pay for this? Those are the types of their concerns. The full survey and the approach are provided in the report, so you can see what that was.
Thank you.
May I, it's my turn. I want to just make an introductory comment, then I want to ask if one of my colleagues on the board, Stephen Spitz, could address the survey. We have sort of a division of labor in our subcommittee, but just with that some issues in public policy, and I have a degree in public policy as well, and that is some basic societal questions are not subject to community vote. their basic rights. You don't put those to the plebiscite. But I'm going to ask Stephen Spitz to address the survey issue.
Yes, thank you. First of all, in the subcommittee 2 report, the majority of the subcommittee, which I was on, said in the report, and it's contained in the materials, that this was not a survey on whether you want a name change or not. That's the most important thing. It was not a survey asking the students whether you wanted a name change. So it is a misrepresentation that it was. What the survey said was a pre-survey, and it was, what would you like to learn more about? Would you like to learn more about the Civil War? Would you like to learn more about what the arguments were for changing the name, for keeping the name? That's what the survey was about, and it's contained in the report, all those results. So it is just a misrepresentation that this was a survey of the student opinion of whether or not to change the name, let alone that the results were to keep the name. That's just not true. Secondly, with respect to the students, there were students, not one, there were in fact 3 students at Jeb Stuart High School who were on the subcommittee. The student body president, Daniel Villegas, Ariana Habibi, and Julia Clark. And all 3 of them joined the majority report, and there were no students on the committee, on the subcommittee, who supported the view of the minority report. And I think that's an important point.
Ms. Corbett-Sanders, I think this is a public meeting being recorded. I think we need to refrain from personally identifying students.
I'm sorry. I thought those names have been identified publicly before. They're all members of the subcommittee, of the committee, appointed by the superintendent. So
We're focusing on the
probably best to-
content.
It's still best to.
Okay, I'm sorry, but I wanted to name them because, this is just not true that the students, wanted the name change as indicated in that survey. That it's in fact, the students who were on the subcommittee all supported the name change. And one of them testified just last Thursday.
Thank you, Mr. Spitz. Appreciate it. Okay. Ms. Koufax, do you have additional questions?
Not at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Evans, please.
Thank you. And I too, like my colleagues, want to very much thank both of you, Mrs. Patton Pace and Mr. Longmire, for joining us today, and everybody in the audience. Most of you I recognize, and I appreciate you being here today and being part of this conversation with us, and a conversation that we've actually had for the better part of, well, actually a little more than 2 years, as a matter of fact. That's when the students originally came to me. It's been just a little more than 2 years ago. So most of my questions have, to the extent I had questions, have been asked and answered by now. I will tell you that I did read both reports very, very thoroughly, and didn't have a lot of detailed questions, just because, of course, I've been immersed in this conversation for 2 years. So most of my questions over the course of time have been answered. I did just want to follow up a little bit to pick up on where Mr. McElveen left off, and perhaps there's no perfect answer to this, but I wanted to give both of you an opportunity to talk a little bit about Mrs. Patton Pace. You talked about trying to find a win-win. That's, with the community engagement that your group did. You talked about trying to find a win-win, and with changing iconography. So I'm not sure I understand where you're going with this. And Mr. Longmire, put this question to you as well. If we didn't change the name, but we're trying to deal with a name that is offensive to at least some students, what would the win-win be there, in your opinion, Mrs. Patton Pace, for finding a way to deal with that?
I would like to see student involvement in making some of those decisions about iconography and maybe the library exhibits, the things they feel are important to work through I think it's going to be a healing process. And as I said, I was really heartened by this one student reaction at Princeton where she said, gee, I wish it had been differently, but okay, I understand. And if we could even get to that point, that people understand why there's a legacy that's a little bit bigger than all of us, I think that would be a win-win. And then what the American Civil War Museum says is to add to the landscape. Should we add maybe some statues? Should we have some murals? Should let the community and the students kind of get involved in that? Princeton outlined a lot of things. One was to draw more minority students into doctoral programs. They wanted more initiatives. They wanted to diversify campus art. Now, the walls are pretty bare at Jeb Stuart. We could diversify by putting some art displays, even having the art department involved in that to show history, to show civil rights, to show, the Brown versus Board of Education. Bring it all up. Bring it all up and get a real discussion going. They also did set up exhibits in their libraries in Princeton, and they're trying to build on that as well. And that's already been started, I think. There's quite a bit underway to broaden the history of the civil rights movement and the whole Civil War and Jeb Stuart at the library right now. But I think there's a lot of creative ways that we can broaden this discussion and really build an understanding of the Virginia history, the Fairfax County history. There's a lot to be proud of. And the Civil War was certainly one of the defining moments in American history that changed who we are. One nation under God, indivisible. And I think we can move forward with that. I also just feel that creativity can be unleashed. And there's a lot of room to be able to bring that win-win and to bring an understanding.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Longmire, is there a way to keep the name but make changes at the school that would reduce what you see as the offensiveness of the name?
I don't see it, Ms. Evans. Let me tell you why. First of all, sorry. I don't see it. I know, Ms. Patton, we've discussed this before about win-win solutions, and I never heard anything that was even a starter. When I hear her solutions, I start to thinking of separate but equal and water fountains for blacks and whites, where I grew up in Mississippi. When I hear compromise, I think Missouri Compromise, and we all know how that turned out with the fugitive slave law and so forth. So I'm sorry, I don't see it, and I say that, as I said earlier, as a Foreign Service officer who have had midnight discussions with Israelis and Palestinians and Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland and Croats and Serbs in Bosnia. And I thought, if anybody can find the common ground, I can do it. My hubris was not was not justified.
Well,
I see the win-win is to rename it after. I see the win-win as renaming it and recognizing the invisible people that have not been recognized in our society, females and people of color, and ideally a twofer. That's my win-win.
Well, again, thank you both. And I will just make the comment that I know that the passions have run high in both directions on this. When we started down this road, I had, whenever I would talk to people, I would say, I hope we can have this be a civil conversation as we go forward. And I do want to make the point that the vast majority of people, I've received hundreds and hundreds of emails, pro and con on this. The vast majority have, in fact, been very reasoned, respectful. And so I don't want to lose sight of that in the fact that emotions have run high on this, that for the most part, this has been a very reasoned conversation. So thank you again, both, and thank you for the members of the ad hoc committee that came out today and for community members as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Wilson.
Thank you. And I appreciate everybody keeping it within the half hour that we set aside at the start of the meeting for this portion of our meeting. So we're a little bit behind schedule, but I think that it's been time well spent, and I certainly appreciate the thoughts that you guys have brought to this. And it's the reports themselves were in some ways phenomenally created and showed a tremendous amount of effort, which it was so much material actually that it was difficult as a board member to sort of read and digest everything. But I think all of us have given it our best effort to do that and to try to understand. So I just have one question for each of you, and they are related to some of the questions earlier. The question I have for you, Mr. Longmire, is at the beginning of the executive summary, you write that it is antithetical to Fairfax County's policy and position on diversity and inclusion to continue to have a school in our community named after a man who took up arms in defense of the enslavement of 4 million people and their descendants. That's a very powerful sentence. My question for you is, if we take that statement on face value, we have a county that has 32 buildings that are either named after or connected to plantations, people who owned slaves, those who fought in the Confederacy. And so I guess, does this statement, by this statement, are you suggesting that we are actually having a much larger question about all of Fairfax County public schools and their facilities, and that we should be considering all of the names in this discussion in terms of, Jeb Stuart being the first of perhaps many changes?
I can't emphasize what I'm going to say next strongly enough. This is about Jeb Stuart and Jeb Stuart only. My daughters go to Jeb Stuart. We represent our community. If other questions should arise, I think you will and should take them on a case-by-case basis. One size does not fit all here. And again, I repeat for the umpteenth time, this is not about who owned slaves. This is about who took up arms against our nation in defense of slavery. There's a world of difference here. Sure, Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. I have no interest in rebranding Thomas Jefferson. I would be right here on the other side of the issue testifying against it. Thomas Jefferson and Madison and Monroe and Mason, all of these men built our country to bring it together. Mr. Stuart was trying to tear it apart. So this is not about who owned slaves, and this is about the school that my daughters attend. That's as far as this. That's where my interest is.
Okay, thank you very much. And for you, Ms. Patton Pace, you mentioned a couple of times that everyone is a victim of the time period in which they live.
Mm-hmm. That was a new thought this morning.
Well, I mean, I've thought about this during this whole conversation, and I just want to sort of explore that a little bit, because it seems to me that using that sort of logic, then perhaps you get to excusing all the decisions that people make in the context in which they live. And I wonder, where would you sort of have that as a historian? Where do you draw that line? When do we not excuse a person from the context in which they live when we look back and say their behavior was objectionable?
Okay, again, context. And in the Civil War and the points that my colleague brings forward, you have to recognize that slavery was just as institutional in the North as it was in the South. And we need to take a look at that as the whole picture. And we need to take a look at why the South seceded. They felt they were being oppressed. There are very involved articles. I can email all of you a fascinating article about the Nullification Act, the different taxes. You got to look at everything. But where do you draw the line about context and who people were in the past? Well, in this conversation over the past few years, we've even had some neighbors post on our neighborhood line that the Confederates were like ISIS and Nazis. And we had a teacher who actually said you might as well, you kids, if you don't want the name change, you might as well call this Hitler High. Really? They practice genocide. They destroy antiquities. None of that happened during the Civil War. So I think when you take context and you take legacy, our legacy of the Civil War moved us forward. It didn't move us backwards. I think we take a look at good and evil, and we take a look at the whole picture. And I don't think that we can draw a conclusion that Jeb Stuart was a bad man. In fact, I remember having a conversation with Mr. Longmire. He has read every book in the library on Jeb Stuart, and he said he wasn't a bad man. He was an honorable man, and we need to take a look at that too.
Okay, and then lastly, just, and this has come up a couple of times, but in terms of the community's desire for change, you mentioned that if it had been a different figure, maybe somewhat higher numbers, and there was money, you might not be sitting here today. I think, if I understand you correctly. And I think I heard Mr. Longmire say that this isn't about a plebiscite. This is about the board making a decision, and I think perhaps reacting to your statement about the naming of the school is antithetical to some of the values within our school system. So for you, Mr. Longmire, is there a small enough level of interest? And for you, Ms. Patton Pace, is there a threshold that is enough public interest that would cause you to sort of say, well, at this level it's enough, and in terms of helping us out moving forward?
I compare this board in some ways as to the Honorable Supreme Court. When the Supreme Court grapples with issues, they don't ask the public, and it's not about numbers. You can't quantify some values. They're not subject to quantification. In terms of your other question about misrepresenting facts, Mr. Moon, I've just heard some things here which, yes, are factually are not true about the positions I've taken. And just one thing, so much is about, massive resistance. True, Richmond played a role in massive resistance. I understand that, and I have read an awful lot about Virginia history, but I don't think you can say that Senator Byrd or the officials or the governor, all the people, that they did not force your predecessors to name my daughter's high school Jeb Stuart. That was a decision that was made by your predecessors right here in this county. Richmond did not name that school. Your predecessors did. And if you believe it was the right decision, then vote to retain it. But if you believe it's wrong, I don't think you have any other choice but to vote to change it.
Would you mind restating the question? Because
So that's very, very quickly, you had mentioned that if the numbers had been different in that survey of support, do you have a threshold in mind? Like, where would that number have been? Would it have been at 51%? Would it have been at 75%? Or?
I think the keepers, we all looked at that regulation and thought it was a community decision and that community input would prevail. And I think we've been shocked that an outside national well-funded organization was introduced into it, and that we're going through this special interest project now because we thought it was a community decision. And we thought that the survey asked that of the community. And we said, no, we didn't want to change the name. And the next thing we know, we're running down this track where we've got people driving across borders, coming from all over the county. We've got people sitting on the ad hoc committee who are outside the Stuart community, and they're all for the change. We were just in shock.
All right, thank you.
In the interest of time, I am not going to pose my questions, as most of them have already been answered. There are some legal questions that code was referenced in the document, which I'll get clarification from our attorney here. And we do have one go back, but if we can keep it to 1 minute and then keep on with what's, in my mind, equally important, which is the conversation amongst board members.
This is key to the conversation, because this is a little bit of a follow-on from both Mr. Moon and Mr. Wilson, and maybe ties in a couple other questions. I'm trying to get clarity on the issue. And I clearly understand that this is the board's decision, but if this is, in the greater context, and Ms. McLaughlin, you brought this up, in the greater context, if this is quote unquote not about who owned slaves, but about who took up arms against the U.S. in defense of slavery. But I just watched a young woman hold up a sign in the audience that said, slave owners do not equal victims. To me, that means it is about slaves. And a vast majority of the emails that we have received have not ever referenced that he took up arms in defense of slavery. It has been about white supremacy, about slavery, about slave ownership. How do we not tie those together unless, are you indefatigably stating that the NAACP and the community that has gotten behind this name change will stop at this name? Like, are you saying that there is no further interest from this community and the NAACP in taking up any of the other names? And at what point is there offensive? And would you consider, for example, people who find Rachel Carson and the Silent Spring issue and the fact that millions of children have died from malaria because of the work on DDT? Can we take up the nature of offensive beyond skin color and on things that have transpired over time historically that certain groups may find offensive? So does it stop here indefatigably, or is that just you're not able to say that?
Well, I think there are about 110 million people in Fairfax County, and I can't speak for, I'm sorry, I misspoke, 1.2 something, or 1.1 something million. I can't speak for anybody but myself, my family, I think, and I think the members of our subcommittee, and is to repeat and to repeat and to repeat, this is about Jeb Stuart. It is only about Jeb Stuart. And as far as the signs, I didn't see it. I cannot speak to a sign that somebody else held up. I can't speak to an email that somebody else sent you. I have written to the board.
You're not here speaking individually. You're here speaking for your committee. And are you saying
I will speak for my subcommittee, yes.
So this was never discussed on your subcommittee that any other school would ever come into play?
We have not made any commitments. Again, our focus is Stuart. Our focus is Stuart. I cannot predict what might happen in the future. My daughters don't go to any other school, and I'm a Stuart parent.
But this didn't come up before now, and so this is coming up in the context of Stuart. But it could potentially, the potential exists then for this to expand to other schools.
Did it come up? We are very aware of the slippery slope argument, and some people have gone so far as say if you rename Stuart, you've got to rename Fairfax County because Lord Fairfax County owned slaves. Well, obviously, this board here cannot rename the county, so you don't have to worry about that. But what you do about other schools, again, if it comes up, you will and you must consider it on a case-by-case basis. There is no slippery slope. One size does not fit all.
Thank you. Is that all? Mr. Longmire, Ms. Patton-Pace, we very much appreciate the very reflective and full answers that you offered to us today. It really helps us as we move forward in the second part of this session to contemplate our next steps. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And once again, from the whole school board, we thank each and every one of you that served on the ad hoc committee for the time and careful reflection that you all spent and took in addressing the charge.
Thank you. It's been a privilege.
Fellow board members, I'm going to suggest we take a 3-minute break because I know it'll take 5 minutes.
Thank you.